what is a looking glass, which probably very few people that are listening have heard about. Maybe some have. It's become more common, that's for sure. In the early 2000s, they began to interview whistleblowers that were working on black ops projects, and they had basically they had heard about the looking glass, and they did an interview with somebody who was directly involved. Now, the looking glass itself is kind of the way it's described. It's like it's like a glass, but it's not really glass. In this case, instead of being like a crystal ball, which is probably the cliched way of looking at it, it's a plasma ball. And in that plasma ball are images that you can see. And this is interesting because when I heard about the looking glass, it was after I'd heard about something, and we interviewed one of the people for Packing from Mars who worked on a project called the Chronovisor. And, I even have a picture, I don't know, like a loose, I don't know if you call it picture, but it's sort of a depiction of this guy called Pellegrino Ernetti. He was a pastor working in the Vatican. He was also a physicist. And his passion was to try and figure out a way to capture audio signals, which had been, his theory was that if because audio is resonance, it's frequency and vibration, and it feeds the magnetic field of the planet. We know that our entire planet is surrounded by a magnetic field, and so he figured out there must be a way you can capture sort of the old remnant resonances of these audio files that are still kind of stored in the magnetosphere, like a giant, you could say, hard drive around the planet. And he was so successful at doing it that it was not just actual sound that he captured, but he actually captured pictures. Gritty looking pictures, and but they were able to, with the device that he created, project sort of a really gritty looking, grainy looking, almost 3D holographic, like black and white image of events that had taken place in the past, as crazy as this sounds. And this was in the 1950s, okay? So that device was shown to the Vatican and to some high brass and Italian high brass, but very quickly vanished because the people that saw it, they were doing tests with it, and they could go back in time and they could listen to, or they, of course, the Vatican wanted to know the crucifixion, right? Is it real? Did it happen? Can we prove it? Can we show it? And before all that got out, it went under, and it only to surface about 20 years later in another project that the man that we interviewed for Packing from Mars, Andrew Bouchago, was involved in, called Project Pegasus, which he said was a combination of something that Nikola Tesla had been creating and the Chronovisor. The only picture I could maybe show you guys is this one, which is the Tesla magical disc, they called it. And apparently Tesla, he's kind of they thought of him as this crazy electrician he's pretty much been erased out of the history books because everyone remembers, Marconi and Thomas Edison. They've heard of Tesla coils, and now, of course, Elon Musk stole the name for Tesla cars. But essentially, what happened is you have Tesla being this amazing scientist who figured out a whole different form of physics, not going on like Einstein's theory of relativity, which is completely flawed, and he plagiarized it anyway. It wasn't even his. But Tesla took this totally different concept of the universe, and he figured out ways to generate electricity wirelessly. All our cell phones, wireless mobile technology, it all comes out of Tesla's work. And of course, because as soon as he figured out how to do electricity wirelessly, his financier, J.P. Morgan, figured out, hey, we're not going to make any money on this, so let's pull the plug. And his amazing Wardenclyffe Tower, which he had created, where he was gonna create the first live demonstration of wirelessly transmitted electricity across the ocean, was knocked out, and that was the end. And we never really heard of Tesla again, although he was involved on working on the technology behind the Philadelphia experiment. Now that's something maybe some of your viewers have also heard about. All these things, there's been films about, and there's been whispers about on the internet. Okay, so fast forward So we have this technology that somehow allows people to peer into other times, remnant times, and maybe not even the future, maybe also the past, and other versions of the present and different timelines. It works into the idea that we don't just live in one dimension or in one timeline. And in quantum physics now, they're coming up with new models and new understandings of the universe that make it clear that we are essentially working in like parallel timelines, and as soon as we make one decision to maybe go right instead of left, or go to the store or not go to the store, we've altered our timeline and created a version of the timeline which is customized to our own new preference. But the way eternity in the universe is supposed to work according to quantum physics is that there also was a version of you that made the other decision, and he went to the store, or he went to the movie, or didn't, or whatever, So these versions of the timeline are virtually invisible, but they're still running parallel to you in another dimension. And so the looking glass technology apparently is based on technology that actually is able to view these timelines. And they found them in like sealed canisters in Iraq, and in these canisters they found building plans for something which looks like this, which was basically a device that had like a water base, and it had a plasma core, and it had these rotating three-dimensional spirals. And when you fire it up, basically the spirals begin to spin faster and faster and faster, to the point where the plasma ball generates this holographic 3D image. And the people, when they discovered it the first time, they realized what they were looking at was their reality. They were looking at their world, but they could recognize that it was in the future. So if you're watching a news broadcast, and the news broadcast, you'd see the newscast, and you would realize they were talking about events that hadn't happened yet. And it's I mean, you can imagine what the people that found it, what was going on in their minds, right? And they found it because they had this is another sort of side topic, but essentially in 1947 there was something called the Roswell crash, and there was a series of about 7 different crashes that began to transpire over the course of the next few years up until 1952. And in each of these crashes, and these ones, this document here is the proof that that this has happened. It's a short briefing that got leaked, and it was tested and verified for being authentic. And they found in this document that they actually captured an extraterrestrial called a J-Rod. Mm-hmm. And this extraterrestrial began a series of, they held him captive in a way for a few years. And during that time, they basically transcribed hundreds of thousands of pages of conversation. And the nutshell of those conversations are described in this document. And so you realize that there's multiple things going on here. There's not just the fact that, there's this looking glass technology, but they found the looking glass technology because of this interaction with these extraterrestrials, who, and the one in the case of J-Rod, came from 52,000 years in the future. So, and it's kind of hard to get your mind around it, but apparently, because all times are simultaneous, the future exists simultaneous to the past. And the people in 52,000 years in the future were actually us. They had actually developed and mutated and, evolved to the point where their bodies shrunk, they became smaller because they had major problems, catastrophic problems on the planet, and they adapted to it, and that changed their physical form. And when they came back 52,000 years to now, they were looking like those typical grays that we see, the big heads and eyes, right, the thin bodies. Well, apparently, there's not just they call them P52, because they found out there's other grays that began to surface from some of the other crashes that came from 45,000 years ago called P45s. And so began this sort of top secret interaction. And MJ12 is an organization that was founded when this began happening because they realized, holy cow, if we don't do something about this quickly, we can't let this get out. People are going to panic. It's going to cause destabilization. We'll lose control of our world system that we've got, our government, our religions. We have to tap it down. We have to dampen it down. And part of Project MJ12 was also to put out debunking information and to begin. That's how the Roswell crash became a crashed weather balloon. Mm-hmm. And they began to ridicule people who were talking about, their experiences with visions of and having had encounters with UFOs. Okay, so anyway, the looking glass information then resurfaced in a video. And going back to Bill Ryan and Kerry Cassidy, who I mentioned earlier, they interviewed a guy called Bill Wood. And Bill Wood was a ex-Navy SEAL who in the 90s, I think it was 97, was actively involved in working on Project Looking Glass. And he was a string theory expert, and they pulled him in because he was particularly good at solving certain problems. And they had this problem in that they, this is all according to Bill Wood. I'll talk a little bit about what Bill Wood tells in this interview. They had this problem that all of the timelines they were watching, they were documenting, and trying to alter. They were experimenting with computers, trying to alter the timeline, of course, in their favor. If you put it, like nothing greater than having a device in front of you where you put something in and then you can see in 40 years what the result was, right? If you want to be president or if you want to win the lottery is the most maybe two kind of really banal versions of that. But they, of course, always had military, targets in view and world hegemony and things like that. And they found that at one point, however, they had this problem is that they were seeing multiple timelines and they could see what happens with these and how they interact. But all of a sudden, at a certain point, all the timelines converged into one. And no matter what they did on all the other timelines, doesn't matter. They always ended up in the same result. And they were baffled by this. And they pulled in Bill Wood and they tried to explain it. And the explanation that Bill Wood gives in this interview, he talks about how at a point, the point being December 21st, 2012, that all of the timelines converge into this one. And that no matter what they did, the version of reality that they wanted got erased, and instead there was this event that took place. And at that event, when that happened, was this kind of mass awakening of humanity. And, and so that moment when everyone woke up, there was this, it was like truth serum, right? When you have this expanded awareness of consciousness, you can suddenly see through the lies, because you have telepathic abilities. If you want to try and imagine what some of these abilities might be, there's a series that was produced called Heroes. And in that series talks about these amazing abilities that certain indigo kids, certain individuals begin to waken into. Except in this case, it was the whole planet.
Quickly, because of 2012 and people saying, well, we were expecting this mass event and everything was going to change overnight. In the big scheme of things, it did change overnight. It does. It just overnight might be 10 years in our perception, but in the grand scheme, 10 years is nothing. It's like it's not even a blink of an eye. So I just wanted to jump, kind of listening. I'm kind of hearing the questions from our viewers. Nothing really big happened in 2012.
Right.
Yes, it did.
It's a good point, but we can go a little bit deeper into that even.
Yes.
Okay, because everyone that lived through that event that was waiting for something to happen, of course, was highly disappointed. And, because so many people had set themselves up for this instantaneous happening. But yes, what you're saying is right, that you can look at it more like, and even the Mayas describe it as not as an event, but as a window of time where things would begin to happen. And we are absolutely, without a doubt, have entered into that change that's happened. And I think it's accelerating and it's accelerating and accelerating. However, there's a couple of things that Bill Wood said in that interview, which, you know, if we fast forward now to the Guardians of the Looking Glass, and which caught my attention because,
What
you
are
know,
the
I've been,
Guardians of the Looking Glass, Frank?
hmm?
Who are the Guardians of the Looking? What is that?
Exactly. What are the who are the guardians of the looking glass? You know, and it's like, you know, we can read in their own words. We are the guardians of the looking glass. We are a group of former intelligence officers and military officials who have come together to release classified information about future events to come. Our knowledge comes from our work on the looking glass artifact, first discovered in Iraq, along with other discoveries in the 1990s. During this time, the artifact was activated by the U.S. military and connected to computers. We were able to see dozens of future timelines and the convergence or singularities that led to two possible outcomes by the year 2030. In one outcome, humanity awakens and the current order is dismantled, and an event occurs, and instead of this event being negative, it is a positive one. In the other outcome, the current structure remains in place, a nuclear war takes place, along with many horrible events. Then the event occurs, and instead of being positive, it is a negative one. Okay, so that's like their opening. This is how they greeted the world, right? And I'm reading this, and I'm like, okay, I mean, they obviously are talking about a project which exists. You know, we know it exists, but there's some new information which is coming into their information stream. One is that directly contradicts what Bill Wood was saying. Bill Wood said the event that took place was the mass awakening of humanity. Okay? But the event that takes place is not the mass awakening of humanity, but it's a cosmic event that happens later. And but what they also said, which then, of course, leads to the mass awakening. But Bill Wood never mentioned the cosmic event. And he says in his version of the Looking Glass that the powers that be, the ones that are manipulating the timelines and that are working with the technology in secrecy, they they find out that no matter how they manipulate it, they lose, and it's game over. And they were so depressed and so bummed out, they just shut the damn thing down, and that's it. Let's make sure it's down. You know, let's try to shut it down, and maybe still we can make it happen. Okay. However, that's not exactly what happened. According to this new information, they actually found out that no matter what they did to manipulate the timeline, it always worked in their favor. And so there was no point in manipulating the timeline any longer. And so because basically if they just carried on, you know, this is essentially a group of people that have already entered into our society and kind of taken it hostage and are at the steering wheel, you know, politically, with media, with technology, with black ops technology that they've basically taken out of the public sector, moved it into the private sector, privately funded it, and built their own breakaway civilization. You know, we talk about that in Packing from Mars, you know, so, and Richard Dolan is the one who came up with that expression, breakaway civilization. It's a group of people that are dealing with technology which is so far advanced that it's like magic to the rest of us. And at some point, they can't even really interact with us anymore because they're already dealing with the magical technology. You know, think back on Tesla's magic disc, right? And we're dealing with, like, you know, the we think is modern, right? The iPhones and, you know, iPads, but that's the stuff they threw away decades ago. You know, and so basically, because they've been meddling, they know that they are at the control of steering society geopolitically, and they are at the control technologically. And they leak out technology bit by bit so they can capitalize on it financially, and so that, you know, we basically are always running after the eight ball. We're never the ones on the cutting edge. And neither are the scientists and the astronauts and all the people in these official public, you know, programs. However, because they do that, they know that their timeline, they've manipulated, they know they're going to win. But here's where it's interesting, and this is where the Guardians of the Project Looking Glass inspired me, and even to the point where I knew I had to write about this right away and get it out there. And the reason that they're publishing the information is because they know and the way they described the technology was never described by Bill Wood, and it's fascinating because Bill Wood makes it sound like they have a computer and they hook it up to the machine and they put in some data and they get a new thing out. But no, it doesn't work that way at all. The way it works is described very accurately by the Guardians of the Looking Glass. They talk about it, this projected plasma ball, which shows us the timeline, having a loop where they watch these events take place, and then after they've taken about 8 days or 7 days, and then the loop starts over again, but it's a different perspective from that timeline. And this happens 144 times. It goes through this 7-day loop 144 times, which amounts to 2.76 years to complete one cycle. And then it starts all over again. And so, these people that were watching and working with the stuff, they had no clue at first what to do with it. So they began to film the stuff, and they documented every cycle. And they used computers to do the documentation, allowing them the quick ability to search keywords and quickly go to years and events and begin to see what happened. That's where they began to experiment. Okay, now if we play around with that timeline, let's see what happens. And they realized that the Looking Glass had already factored in the fact that they were going to try and alter the timeline, and it would always be reflected like a self-fulfilling prophecy. Hence, they realized, hey, it doesn't matter what we do. If we continue on the course we're on, we're going to have our result. And they want this result, and
which kind of confirms what quantum physics and spirituality have been saying, is that if you observe something, if you look for something, it's going to appear because you're the observer looking for it. So that's how we understand how we really create reality as well. So it's one full circle moment, really, and we're just now talking about this through technological terms, but it's really the bigger concept of how creation or co-creation works, right?
Right, exactly. So they knew here they are. They knew that they had this thing working in their favor, but then all of a sudden something weird happened, an anomaly happened, and maybe the anomaly is what Bill Wood was, jumping in on. But the anomaly was that there are 3 years, there are 3 cycles. 3 years in which something weird happened, an anomaly happened, and it pushed the odds away from their favorable outcome toward a totally different outcome. And that outcome was what caused their demise, basically. And those years were 2012, 2016, and 2022. Interesting 6-year intervals. But in each of those 3 years, there was a pattern. Seemed to be an intervention, where all of a sudden, and they'd be calculating odds. Bill Wood talks about the calculation of the odds. They were calculating odds that would go in their favor and which wouldn't go in their favor. And they realized that all of a sudden in those years, there was this other probability that there was another timeline that would emerge, and they would be losing control.
Do you have any what do you think was 2016? 2012, we can kind of see that was, we all felt this, but what was 2016 in your view?
Well, 2016 was, I think there was like financial things that were going on the planet at that point. And I think the introduction of Bitcoin began to take root around that time. And, at least the early pioneers of cryptocurrency, because cryptocurrency apparently plays a role in whether these people are successful or not, mainly who controls it. Mm-hmm. And what are we hearing now on an almost daily news cycle basis? We're hearing about the Fed wants to introduce some form of cryptocurrency for the future, a digital currency.